Trump handed the homeless man a bill without even expecting a thank you. But when he happened to notice that he shared some of the money with another homeless man, something changed. At first, he was surprised. Why does a person who has nothing give to others? What makes a person without a roof over his head share the last of his money, while those who have everything rarely lend a helping hand? Curious, he decided to watch what would happen next, and what he saw made him think like never before. The night was cool, with a crisp breeze cutting through the towering buildings of New York City. Donald Trump stepped out of an upscale restaurant, the echoes of clinking glasses and murmured conversations fading behind him. The evening had been another gathering of high society, filled with discussions of business deals, politics, and the usual parade of power plays. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit and started walking towards his car, where his driver stood waiting. As he moved down the sidewalk, he noticed a figure seated near the curb, a man wrapped in layers of old, tattered clothing, his beard unkempt, his eyes tired but alert. He was one of the many invisible faces of the city, the kind that people passed by without a second glance. However, something about this particular man caught Trump's attention. Perhaps it was the way he sat, not slouched in complete defeat, but with a quiet dignity, as if he had long accepted his reality without letting it crush him. Before Trump could reach his car, the man lifted a hand slightly, signaling for his attention. "Excuse me, sir." The man's voice was rough, weathered by hardship. "Would you have a little spare change for a meal?" Trump paused, glancing at the man. He was used to encounters like this. New York had its share of desperate souls asking for help. Many of them carried signs, told rehearsed stories, or rattled cups of coins. But this man did none of that. He simply asked, his voice steady, without the tremor of desperation or deceit. For a moment, Trump considered walking on. It was easy to dismiss such requests. He had done it countless times before. Not out of cruelty, but because he had learned long ago that giving money directly to people on the street often led to poor decisions. Yet, something in this man's gaze made him hesitate. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a crisp $20 bill and handed it to him. "There," Trump said, already turning to leave. He wasn't expecting gratitude, nor did he need it. It was a simple gesture, one that he had done and forgotten many times before. But as he took a few steps toward his car, something unexpected caught his eye. The homeless man didn't immediately tuck the bill away or rush off to spend it. Instead, he glanced around and, spotting another homeless man sitting a short distance away, got up, walked over, and handed him a portion of the money. The second man accepted it with a nod, and they exchanged a few words before the first man continued on his way. Trump stopped mid-step, watching the interaction unfold. His initial thought was skepticism. Was this a ploy? A way to make it seem like he was generous so that others would be more inclined to give? But as he observed further, he saw the sincerity in the act. This man who had nothing had given away part of the little he had just received. Curiosity sparked in Trump's mind. He was a businessman, a deal-maker, someone who understood human nature in the context of power and negotiation. But this was different. He had seen billionaires hoard wealth with an iron grip, unwilling to part with a single dollar unless it benefited them. And yet, here was a man who had next to nothing, and he had willingly given away part of it without hesitation. Instead of entering his car, Trump chose to follow the man at a distance, watching his movements. The man continued walking, his stride steady but unhurried, until he reached a small corner store. He pushed open the door and disappeared inside. Trump waited outside, watching through the glass. The homeless man approached the counter and carefully selected a few simple items: a sandwich, a bottle of water, and an apple. He counted out the change from what remained of the $20, ensuring he had enough, before handing it to the cashier. Then came the moment that surprised Trump even more. As the man turned to leave, he glanced at a woman sitting outside the store, huddled against the cold. Without a second thought, he crouched down and handed her the sandwich. She looked at him with wide eyes, her expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. He merely nodded before walking away, taking only the water and the apple for himself. Trump found himself frozen in place. He had expected the man to spend the money, perhaps recklessly or selfishly, as so many assumed the homeless would. But instead, he had done the opposite. He had taken what little he had and ensured that not only he but others had something to eat. Something about it unsettled Trump. Not in a negative way, but in a way that forced him to reconsider things he had taken for granted. Why did a man with nothing share so freely, while those with immense wealth often found it so difficult? The question nagged at him, pushing him towards a decision he rarely made. He was going to talk to this man, not as a businessman, not as a billionaire, not as a politician, but simply as a person curious about another. With a determined step, Trump followed the man further down the street, preparing to ask the question that was already forming in his mind. Why do you, with nothing, give so much, while those who have everything often give so little? Trump followed the homeless man at a steady pace, keeping enough distance to avoid making his presence known too soon. He was accustomed to analyzing people, understanding their motives, predicting their next moves. But this man was different. His actions defied the expectations Trump had built over a lifetime in business and politics. There was no angle, no hidden agenda. He gave because it seemed natural to him. The homeless man turned down a quieter street, his posture unchanged, his movements deliberate yet unhurried. Trump noticed how he observed his surroundings, not with the paranoia of someone fearing for their safety, but with the attentiveness of a man who had learned to survive by understanding his environment. Finally, after a few blocks, the man settled on a bench in a small park. The city lights reflected dimly off the pavement, casting long shadows of passing pedestrians. Trump hesitated for a moment, then took a breath and walked forward. He didn't often engage in conversations without an agenda, but tonight, curiosity had overridden habit. The man noticed him approaching and gave a small nod, as if he had expected Trump to follow. "You've been watching me," the man said, his voice calm but not unkind. Trump didn't immediately respond. He studied the man's face in the dim light. Lines of hardship etched deep into his skin, but his eyes remained sharp. There was no fear in them, no sense of inferiority. He carried himself like a man who had come to terms with his reality. "I saw what you did," Trump finally said, standing a few feet away. "You gave part of what I gave you to someone else. Then you bought food and gave even more away." The man shrugged, setting the bottle of water beside him. "Wasn't much, but I wasn't the only one hungry." Trump sat down at the other end of the bench, a deliberate move. He rarely sat beside strangers, but tonight was different. He needed answers. "You barely had anything yourself," Trump continued. "Why didn't you just keep it all?" The man exhaled, rubbing his hands together to warm them. "Because I know what it's like to have nothing. When you've been hungry enough times, you start to notice when someone else is worse off than you." Trump leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. It was a foreign concept to him. Not that he had never struggled. He had fought hard to build his empire, faced losses, failures, betrayals. But true hunger, true desperation, that was something he had never known. "You didn't even hesitate," Trump mused. "Most people don't give away anything unless they know they have plenty." The homeless man chuckled dryly. "That's the difference between people who've had everything and those who've had nothing. When you've had everything, you fear losing it. When you've had nothing, you know how to survive with less." Trump studied him, the words settling in his mind like a stone dropped into deep water. "What's your name?" Trump asked after a pause. The man glanced at him for a moment, as if debating whether to answer. Then, with a small smile, he said, "David." Trump nodded slowly. "How did you end up here, David?" David took a sip from his bottle, staring out at the darkened skyline. "Same way most people do. A few bad choices. A few things outside my control. Lost my job. Bills piled up. My wife got sick. When she passed, I lost everything trying to keep up with the medical costs. The rest just kind of happened." Trump remained silent for a moment. He had heard stories like this before, but they had always been statistics, news reports, things that existed in articles rather than real life. Hearing it directly from the man who had just selflessly given away what little he had made it different. David stretched his legs out in front of him. "You see, Mr. Trump, people always think the worst part about being homeless is being hungry. It's not. It's being invisible." That struck something deep. Trump had spent his entire life making sure he was never ignored, always seen, always relevant. The idea of being invisible, overlooked by society, discarded without a second thought, was foreign to him. David continued, "People walk past you every day and pretend you don't exist. They avert their eyes, cross the street. You become something they don't want to acknowledge. Not because they're cruel, but because it makes them uncomfortable. They don't want to think about how easy it is to end up here. Trump considered his words carefully. He had built skyscrapers, run empires, stood on the world's biggest stages, but this conversation felt more real than any deal he had ever negotiated. He finally said, "You're right. Most people with money, even those who donate to charity, they don't really see people like you. They just throw money at the problem and move on." David smirked. "And yet here you are, talking to me instead of getting into your fancy car and heading home." Trump chuckled. "You got my attention, I'll give you that." David glanced at the streetlight flickering above them. "You know, Mr. Trump, you gave me $20 tonight. That's something most people wouldn't do. But the real question is, why did you follow me?" Trump leaned back against the bench, looking up at the stars barely visible through the city haze. He didn't have an answer yet, but he knew one thing. This conversation wasn't over. Trump sat in silence for a moment, his thoughts swirling as he studied the man beside him. He had spent his entire life in circles where wealth dictated status, where power came from what you owned and controlled. Yet here sat a man who had lost everything, and somehow he still had something most of Trump's wealthiest associates lacked: compassion without conditions. The air was crisp, and the city's ever-present hum filled the silence between them. Finally, Trump turned his gaze back to David, whose expression remained unreadable. "You say people ignore you," Trump finally said, his voice quieter than before. "But I'm listening." David exhaled a short laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, you're not most people, are you?" Trump didn't respond to that. Instead, he leaned forward slightly. "I've given away millions to charity, funded shelters, meal programs, and yet, you sit here telling me that the real problem is being invisible." David nodded. "Charity helps, sure, but it doesn't change the way people see us. It doesn't stop them from walking past like we don't exist. You know what's worse than being poor, Mr. Trump? Being treated like you don't matter." Trump tapped his fingers against his knee, considering those words. He had built an empire on perception. He knew the power of being seen, of making a presence so undeniable that people had no choice but to acknowledge you. Yet here was a man who had been erased from society, not through failure, but through circumstance. "What would you do," Trump asked, "if you had a second chance?" David looked at him, the question catching him off guard. For the first time, something shifted in his gaze, an old spark of something long buried. Hope? Or maybe just a memory of it. "Honestly," David sighed, "I'd work. I never wanted handouts. I had a life before all this. A job, a home. I just lost my way. And once you fall, it's hard to climb back up when no one wants to see you." Trump nodded slowly. He had heard many excuses in his life, but David's words didn't sound like excuses. They sounded like the truth. The businessman in him recognized something, a potential investment, though not in money but in a person. He had spent decades betting on people, identifying who had the drive to rise and who would crumble under pressure. "Stand up," Trump said abruptly. David frowned. "What?" "Stand up." David hesitated, but eventually pushed himself up from the bench. He was tall, a little hunched from years on the streets, but there was still strength in his posture. Trump stood too, adjusting his coat. "You want a second chance?" David narrowed his eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't give away things for free," Trump said, his tone shifting into something more familiar, businesslike, direct. "But I do make investments, and you, David, might just be worth one." David scoffed. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Trump countered. "You had $20. You could have spent it on yourself, but you didn't. That tells me more than you think." David was silent, his hands slipping into the pockets of his worn-out jacket. "What exactly are you offering?" Trump smiled slightly. "A job, a fresh start, but you'd have to prove yourself." David let out a long breath, staring down the street as if trying to convince himself this wasn't some strange dream. "And if I fail?" Trump smirked. "Then you'll be right back where you are now. But something tells me you won't." The offer hung between them, heavier than the night air. For the first time in a long while, David had a choice: stay in the shadows or step back into the light. And for once, someone was watching, waiting to see what he would do next. David stood there for a long moment, the weight of Trump's offer pressing down on him like an unfamiliar burden. A second chance. It sounded simple, but for a man who had spent years navigating the harsh realities of the streets, it wasn't just an opportunity. It was a risk. A risk of believing, of hoping, of stepping back into a world that had long since turned its back on him. Trump watched him carefully, his sharp eyes assessing the hesitation. He had spent a lifetime making quick decisions, judging character within seconds. And right now, David was at a crossroads, one that would determine not only his own future, but the worth of Trump's gamble. Finally, David inhaled deeply and nodded. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "I'll take that chance." A small, satisfied smirk tugged at the corner of Trump's mouth. "Good," he said. "Let's see what you can do." Without another word, he motioned for David to follow him. They walked side by side through the quiet streets, the neon glow of city lights reflecting off the damp pavement. David still wasn't sure if this was real, if a man like Trump truly meant what he said. But for the first time in a long time, he was willing to find out. They reached Trump's car, a sleek black limousine that looked out of place against the worn-down city blocks. The driver opened the door, but David hesitated. He hadn't been in a car like this in years, maybe longer. He ran a hand through his scruffy hair, then squared his shoulders and stepped inside. The interior was as luxurious as expected. Leather seats, a built-in bar, the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air. Trump slid in beside him, tapping a few buttons on a panel. "We're heading to one of my properties," he said. "You'll stay there for now. Tomorrow we'll talk business." David nodded, still trying to process the absurdity of the situation. Just hours ago, he was on the streets, unseen, unwanted. Now he was sitting across from one of the most powerful men in the world, being offered a chance that felt almost too good to be true. Trump studied him, his expression unreadable. "You said you had a job before. What did you do?" David exhaled slowly. "Construction. Spent years building things for people who never even knew my name." Trump nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. "Hard work," he said. "Good. I don't hire people who expect handouts. If you're serious about this, you're going to earn it." David met his gaze, something solid settling in his chest. "I don't want a handout. I just want a chance." Trump smirked. "Then you're in the right place." The car sped through the city, heading towards a future David never expected. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had something he hadn't had in a long time, a purpose. David awoke the next morning to the unfamiliar sensation of a soft bed beneath him. The mattress was firm, the sheets crisp, the pillows supportive rather than a wadded-up coat against concrete. For a moment, he lay still, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had only dreamt the events of the previous night. But as his fingers traced the edge of the fine linens, he knew this was real. He sat up, stretching his aching limbs, remnants of years spent sleeping on the streets still deeply embedded in his muscles. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the high-rise apartment Trump had arranged for him. It was more than he had ever imagined, a temporary shelter that felt closer to royalty than anything he had experienced before. The space was pristine, minimal but elegant, a reflection of the man who owned it. David took a deep breath, grounding himself. This wasn't permanent. It was a test, a chance, as Trump had called it, and he wasn't about to waste it. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He walked over, hesitated for a moment, then pulled it open. A well-dressed man stood there, holding a suit draped neatly over his arm. "Mr. Trump requested that you wear this today," the man said smoothly. "There's a car waiting outside. He expects you in 1 hour." David nodded, taking the suit without a word. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving him alone once more. He ran his fingers over the fabric, dark, high quality, tailored to fit someone of his size. It had been a long time since he had worn anything other than second-hand clothes salvaged from shelters. This, like the apartment, felt surreal. He showered, shaved, and dressed. When he finally looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. The man staring back at him looked put together, presentable, maybe even respectable. It was strange how something as simple as clean clothes could shift a person's entire demeanor. An hour later, he stepped out of the building to find a black SUV idling at the curb. The driver nodded as David climbed in, and they pulled smoothly into traffic. The ride was quiet, allowing him time to gather his thoughts. He had no idea what Trump had planned for him today, but he knew one thing. This was his moment to prove he was worth a gamble. When they arrived, David found himself in front of a towering construction site. Steel beams stretched into the sky. Workers moved methodically across the scaffolding, the sound of machinery filling the air. It was a world he once knew, a place where his hands had shaped foundations and raised walls. Trump was waiting near the entrance, dressed in one of his signature suits, arms crossed as he observed the site. When he saw David approach, he gave a small nod of approval. "You clean up well," Trump said. David smirked. "Feels strange, but I'll get used to it." Trump gestured toward the site. "You said you work construction. Let's see what you remember." David followed him inside, stepping onto familiar ground. The scent of fresh concrete, the sound of drills, the organized chaos. It was like stepping into a past life. Trump led him toward a group of foremen, men who had clearly been briefed on his presence but still regarded him with skepticism. "This is David," Trump introduced. "He's got experience in the field. Put him to work." The foreman, a burly man with a clipboard, sized him up. "You ever run a team before?" David nodded. "Years ago. Built everything from high-rises to family homes." The foreman grunted, then handed him a hard hat. "All right then, let's see if you've still got it." David took the hat, securing it on his head. As he stepped into the heart of the construction site, the weight of the moment settled over him. This was his chance, his real test, and he had no intention of failing.